right. This is usually the comic relief at the end of these conferences. So after such profound discussions, I'm just going to talk about a very narrow subject. And that narrow subject is an observation from playing in one of the most competitive markets today in the past 5 years, which is the one of B2B cloud software companies. A market that at about 10 years ago had probably one hypergrowth company, and today it has more than 30. These companies are, you probably heard of some of the names like Snowflake, who've completely changed the private equity markets and the equity markets when it launched and started these hyper valuations that we see now in 10 billion, 30 billion for very, very small companies. There's a reason why it's interesting to understand from the inside why these companies are growing so much, why they're so valuable, and why they are so competitive. So thank you very much for having me here. And again, glad to be the comic relief for the conference. So OutSystems is a cloud software company. We compete in this cluster of companies. The anatomy of selling cloud software to the enterprise is very particular. And a lot of digital platforms, a lot of the digital transformation that you see in almost every company that's going through the world is based on software sold by these type of companies where we are part of. And so we compete global. We are part of the fabric of the digital foundation of a lot of customers in more than 20 industries and around 70 countries in the world. All right. So what are these hypergrowth companies? We're talking about companies that have revenues between 200 to 1 billion. Of course, they're bigger. They've started a little bit earlier. But this is the major cluster, 200 million in revenue to about 100 billion. But the fundamental characteristic is some of them are growing at about 80 to 100% at $100 billion revenues. But typically, they all grow at about 35 to 80% year-on-year growth. Okay, so we're talking about extremely fast growth, even for the whole digital, the whole technology sector. One of the ways these companies, and we have a lot of more recent ones, is that they have figured out what is the operating model to create these hypergrowth companies. And it starts when they are very, very small. And so one of the fundamental aspects of these companies is that when they start up, they already start up to scale up. So the typical way these companies are created and then they grow is fundamentally based on two phases. The first phase is what's called product market fit. And product market fit is a term that you guys have probably heard a lot in the past recent couple of years, maybe 2 to 5 years. And it's one of the favorite sentences in Silicon Valley. Product market fit is an extremely particular phase of the company because what it means is that it's not only important to be innovative at the product side, but it's very important to very early discover what in Silicon Valley is called that sucking noise, which is a huge demand very early for the product that you have. And so there's a huge amount of tuning, feedback loops. And a lot of companies, if they cannot get this product market fit very quickly, they basically just close the company and move on. Very, very dynamic, very Darwinistic type of model. The moment they hit this fit between a particular type of market and product, the fundamental baseline is 100% plus growth rates per year. So we're talking about extremely fast growth at the initial stages. The reason why this is important is for a lot of reasons, but the main one is that cloud software companies today, they sell based on subscription models. And subscription models, there's a huge amount of market grab and consumption before cash comes in, and then before revenue gets accrued. And so these companies can go into high investment mode and high growth mode without really that becoming visible in the P&L of the companies. So when we're talking about 100% growth rates, it's really around 100% growth rates in adoption and consumption, because that's the base where they can then go into what's called the hockey stick. The hockey stick, that hypergrowth curve, is fundamentally harnessed on one fundamental thing, which is creating one or two, preferably one, repeatable transaction. A very simple transaction, a transaction where the demand into that journey of demand to value and then to value to monetization and to revenue or to cash needs to be extremely frictionless and extremely repeatable. And that repetition usually requires a very large homogeneous market. And so whenever these companies build, there is a trade-off that they need to get product market fit into a very homogeneous market, but at the same time, it needs to be big enough so that they can grow into a trampoline into the early cycles of that hypergrowth, and so that they can exercise that repeatable transaction and still hit about $100 million of revenue. And typically between $50 to $100 million of revenue, it depends on the consumption patterns of the company, that product market fit phase kind of ends. Now, Europe is an interesting market from an homogeneity point of view, which is to say that it doesn't exist. And so, as a B2B company, when we started about several years ago, when we look into Europe, Europe is actually a quilt of countries. So it's not a unified market, except for certain type of products and certain type of brands that are well recognized. But for startups, it's very, very difficult, and especially for when we sell to enterprises, where references are very important to go and sell to the next buyer. References in Europe are not transferable usually between countries, okay? Now, we had a huge, from a market point of view, Europe therefore had to fight the United States with an homogeneous market of about 300 million and a much higher spend rate. So we had a big disadvantage, especially if you're coming from a small country. This was what Israelis fixed this problem by creating what's called a double head type of companies about 15 years ago, where they had R&D in Israel and they had sales and marketing from day one in the United States. And so they benefit from a large heterogeneous primary market by selling directly into the United States. There was a fallacy that Europe was a $450 million market, but in fact, it was a scattered collection of countries. Now, these things are changing, and which gives us a lot of hope, because the sale of incorporeous goods like cloud services or cloud software, with the new operating models of these hypergrowth companies, the penetration is extremely, extremely low friction, which basically means one of the characteristics of a low friction landing or penetration is that there's really very little people involved. There's almost no salespeople, no support people. It's a self-service process that occurs across the cloud. And that has dramatically lowered the barriers of entry for the countries, because we don't need to go and deal with labor legislations. We don't need to go and speak German or French or Spanish or Italian, all these languages, because a lot of these purchases are done in self-service by the customer themselves, and most customers today in a lot of these products, for a lot of these products, they actually speak English. And so those barriers have gone down. However, because one of the fundamental aspects is that the US market has particular characteristics in terms of the fact that they're always a little bit ahead in terms of innovation. They move much faster and they spend much more, which basically means that a lot of these companies need to win the United States market if they ever want to compete globally as hypergrowth, which basically means that even as a European company, you need to go and become focus on the United States market. And so up until 100 million, the fundamental premise for a lot of these companies is, well, regardless of what you are, you need to win the United States market. Then as you hit that and you enter the hockey stick grows, and that second phase, which is what we call company building, again, this lack of barriers in these dynamics of sale that we're seeing today come into play. And that's why today these companies are growing at a much faster rate as they move out of the United States because of the lack of barriers they're encountering both in Europe and Asia Pacific. There's a couple of other issues related here, but these are probably the most important one. Now, what's interesting is that in this phase, you got product market fit, and you just need to accelerate that hockey stick. Everyone is going at that fast rate. So it's a very Darwinistic environment of extreme change, and whoever goes faster ends up by winning it all. And so that's why today you guys see fundamentally a very small number of cloud companies. The market has fundamentally been taken away from all the others that came second. So you got Amazon, you got Microsoft, you got Google Cloud, and you got the one Chinese or the two Chinese companies that remain. And so it's impossible now to have a competitive cloud company, infrastructure cloud company coming out of anywhere else. So when you go into this hockey stick, you need to have very fast access to very large investment funds, which a lot of money is available for these companies. So this is not a problem. Money has become fundamentally, these companies, when they reach this stage, they are well known worldwide. But this is one of the major issues. The problem is that the companies are growing such a fast rate. So if a company is growing close to 80%, they move into from 200 million to about 400 million in 1 year and a half. A company that's managed at 200 million is very different from one that's managed at 400 million. And then they move into 650 or 700 million. And so these stages are so fast, they occur so fast that you have to replace almost the management team as you rotate to this. So there is a huge rotation of talent, not because the talent is not good, they're great, they just don't have enough time to learn, and so you need to actually go and hire experienced people as fast as possible. Where is these experienced people that have already done it before? The United States. Because they've started earlier, that's where you can find people. And if you hit about 800 million or 1 billion, typically about 1 year and a half ago, used to be the West Coast. So you could not find really a certain type of profiles outside Silicon Valley or the Seattle base. So the life of these companies is that every 2 to 3 to 5 years, you need to rebuild the company almost completely. So it's an extremely pressure environment with a lot of rotation and a lot of companies kill over. And so the speed and perseverance and capacity to hold on to all this change is absolutely of the essence. And if I had to close this presentation and say, what is the fundamental characteristic for success in this hyper-competitive world with companies like this? Is the capacity to make extremely fast decisions. Now, the United States, the Americans, have a huge advantage here. Why? They decide fast. They're very fast at decision. They talk very little. They move on. They make a decision. Sometimes it's not the correct one, but they move on. They iterate and they correct it. And they move and they move and they move. And they move very fast. And without friction, without barriers, the winners are really the companies and the context, the environments, governments, authorities that can make decisions as fast as possible. So if I had to ask for something for everyone where we do business, is that please make decisions fast. They might not be the correct ones, but please make them fast. Thank you very much.